Photography rules are great starting points, but they don't necessarily have to be followed to the letter of the law. In fact, if you break those rules from time to time, especially in real estate photography, you could unleash some creativity and get some very impactful photos. What I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to recommend some rules that you can break that can really make your photos stand out under certain conditions doing real estate photography. So let's start with something very simple and we'll work our way up to the top. The first rule to consider breaking is this rule of everything's got to be kept vertical all the time. Now in real estate photography, yes, we do want to have vertical alignment. It's very important, but there are times when we really need to break this rule. When I shot this dual staircased entryway, I could barely see one of the selling features, which is not just the chandelier at the top, but also the recess it went into. I could see the chandelier and recess when shooting at the top of the stairs, but it really didn't do it justice. So instead, in cases like this, consider tilting your camera up, which in this case shows the grandeur of this entryway by showing how tall the ceilings were and of course the chandelier and painted ceiling recess. This is a case when breaking that verticals rule is highly beneficial. The second rule to consider is the ISO rule. So it used to be in the old days that we'd want to shoot at ISO 100 to get very clean images. But nowadays, that rule doesn't apply anymore, and you might be surprised how high you can go with your ISO and at the same time get better quality photos. Here's a graph from dxomark.com showing the signal to noise ratio for a Nikon Z6. We can see from the green line and above, that's excellent image quality. And in this case, it shows that ISOs up to 500 have imperceivable differences in quality. And above the yellow line, which is still very acceptable quality, those ISO values go up to almost 2000. Now, there are a couple reasons why raising your ISO is a really good thing doing real estate photography. If we're talking about exteriors, you can do stuff handheld with a higher ISO because you can use a faster shutter speed and not have to worry about motion blur. Now, I like to use a tripod even outside. It helps with bracketing any of the photos that I'm doing on my exterior shots. But if you're in a hurry, and especially for tight areas, keeping that ISO even from just 100 up to 200 means that instead of using on a sunny day a shutter speed for f8, if the shutter speed was 1/250th of a second at f8, then you could use a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second if you were using ISO 200 instead of ISO 100. The other case to consider is when you're shooting something inside. So for interiors, if you're using flash, a higher ISO means using less flash power. It then makes it easier to light a scene. Now, there is a sweet spot for this because you still have to be able to cut out enough of the ambient light to really use flash effectively. So with that, the sweet spot I usually find is below 500. It's usually about ISO 320, and you can even get good views to the outside. And of course, when doing window pulls, you could also just lower your ISO. But overall, lighting the interior, you don't need to keep your ISO level at 100. You're just going to be emitting so much flash that you could be causing more problems, like with color cast. Moving along now into some of more of my favorites here of some of the rules to break. I want to get to all those here shortly, but I just wanted to take a quick break and mention that if you did want to learn more about doing real estate photography, I'd invite you to take a look at my courses on real estate photography. I have online courses that teach professional interiors, expert editing, exteriors, videography, business and marketing, and I've also written a series of books on real estate photography as well, and I have links to all of that down in the description of this video. Moving into our next rule, it's known as the capture everything rule. And if you've done real estate listing photography, you know that everybody wants to see everything. And yes, we do want to show space because space sells, but this is a rule that needs to be broken at times. Take, for instance, these wide shots of this kitchen, which show the space and follow the capture everything rule, but this doesn't show the features very well. This is a simple case when breaking this simple rule works very well to show what I call the critical counters, which is showing some close-up views of the kitchen features. You should still have shots that show the entirety of a space, but it's best to also add shots that highlight the selling features. And that goes for this room, for instance, which was not shot so wide as to show the entire room, since the goal here was to highlight the accordion doors, which were captured even closer in other shots as well. If only shooting the entire room, then we would have left out a high-priced feature. So capturing specific images for this feature was a rule worth breaking. Once again, you do need to show a room's entirety, but those shouldn't be your only compositions. And by the way, this was especially important because this was for an architectural and design shoot, and they really didn't care so much about the space of the room, it's the selling features. But even in the listing market, showing these accordion doors, which are very expensive, is very important. The next rule is somewhat tangential to the last, and that's the wide angle rule. Now, as real estate photographers, we're known and stereotyped to shoot things very wide and sometimes super wide. Sometimes that can be useful, but in other times it can really work against us. So we need to break this rule at times. Let's take a look at two shots to show extreme cases. In this first shot, this kitchen was small with very little room to photograph it, but a single point perspective worked well when my lens was racked out to a super wide 14mm full frame. Now, while that captured the space with some extension distortion on the edges, it's acceptable, but when we take a look at this view shot of this wall of windows, even though it's the same house and also a single point perspective, this used 24mm to provide some telephoto compression, bringing the views closer. If this was 14mm, then the views would have been farther away. Now, in between those two extremes is this case of a large interior area that used 18mm. That reduced the amount of wide-angle extension distortion, but also while providing some telephoto compression while still capturing the entire space. The next rule to consider breaking at times is the orientation rule, and this really applies to listing photos, not really the architectural and design market. But as you may know, if you're publishing to listing services, your multiple listing service, things that are going to get syndicated out then to, for instance, Zillow, Redfin, and all these other websites, if you don't keep them in landscape orientation or horizontal orientation, if you try to shoot vertical and portrait orientation, those websites may automatically turn those, thinking that it was supposed to be rotated. We don't want that to happen. So a lot of times we try to shoot everything just in that horizontal, that landscape orientation, but we don't always have to do that, even for the listing market. First though, to reiterate, if you're shooting for the A&D market, not the listing market, then you will likely take quite a few vertical shots, since these clients will publish your photos differently, like on their websites and social media. But for the listing market, well, we can still go vertical. Take this bathroom, for instance, which has a small shower, which you can see in the reflection of the mirror on the right. But it was very hard to get to, but I wanted to include that. So to include that shower in a separate shot required a vertical orientation. So in cases like this, well, I took another vertical shot of the bathroom at a different angle and then made a landscape-oriented collage of those two photos. So here I'm able to break the landscape orientation only rule for the listing market while not being affected by sites doing auto rotation. The next rule that I want to talk about is the vignetting rule, and wide-angle lenses tend to have a lot of vignetting to them, and yes, a lot of that can be taken out in post, but we really like to have that very clean where we don't see vignetting at the edges, but sometimes it's really good to break this rule. Take this shot of this entrance, for example, where I lit the inside of a house with flash to make it brighter than the outside. But what really helps to draw the viewer's attention through those front doors and into the house is some vignetting that was added to this image. Here's the original image with no vignetting applied to it. It's been completely corrected. Now, that's okay, but it's not all that impactful. Adding some vignetting, though, in this case, adds more wow factor to the photo, pulling the viewer in and inside that house. Now, this can work against you in many shots, but when you want to focus on something central to the photo, the vignetting rule is worth breaking. Now, this isn't to say that you should go out and break every single rule of photography that you ever learned. The rules are there for a reason. But the thing is, if you only follow the rules, then you could be holding yourself back. Remember that sometimes breaking the rules and being aware of when you can allows you to have not just flexibility, but also creativity.